Everyone can see that? Is that fine?
Sure. Very good.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to present to the students here. I'm very excited to present this and towards the end get some discussion. I'm really interested in perhaps differences and similarities between our two countries, which I think will be quite exciting. So I'd like to start first by acknowledging that I'm presenting on the unceded lands of the traditional custodians of the land and waters of the Awabakal and Worimi people at Mullumbimba, now known as Newcastle. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to country itself. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. Sovereignty was never ceded. And I pay my respects to other First Nations people who might be present today. So the focus of my presentation is on the role of festivals in domestic tourism in Australia, and more specifically that of smaller regional towns. Tourism is one of Australia's largest industries, and it plays a crucial role in the economic and social fabric of much of regional Australia. For example, prior to the pandemic, for every tourism dollar earned in 2019, 44 cents was spent in regional Australia, so almost half of every dollar. And with COVID, we saw the impact when backpacker tourism was halted in terms of fruit picking and the agricultural industry. That's had a huge impact. So even though they're tourists, they're actually very much important in our economic development here as well. So that's something for us to think about. Now, within this, festivals are very much part of these regional economies, one of a small but significant range of tourism development tools available to local authorities working on limited budgets. And this has led to substantial investment in these resources. Indeed, regional festivals are very much embedded within regional development research and practice, rather than intermittent social events. So they're very much tied into the calendar of these local communities. And they've been the catalyst for economic, social, and environmental transformation. In addition to these economic benefits, festivals are integral to creating and negotiating how we make, how we frame, and how we represent various relationships between people and places. They're a means to express, celebrate, and even challenge the core values of a particular community. So the benefits are twofold. Festivals create a sense of community and belonging located in a specific location. And festivals are structured to find ways to represent and share this idea of a community that may then attract an audience that can help generate income for that location. The effectiveness of festivals lies in the atmospheres created through various scripted and informal activities that in successful events work in and with the materiality of place. So there's something about the way festivals draw on streets, draw on buildings, draw on the histories of these communities that serve to create this idea of community. An important part of festival participation is in the range of experiences that generate emotions, mood, and memories that help us connect or even disconnect to these people and places. So we might feel really captured and excited by these events and want to be part of it. But for some people, it may actually bring about feelings of, I don't want to be here, I don't feel that I belong here. So that's something for us to think about as well when we're using festivals as development strategies. So inherent to these experiences, especially of feeling connected, is the closeness we have between, say, performers or artists and the audience. So it brings about this joy of an immersive, large crowd experience. So this helps build these feelings. And of course, as I've said, not denying that not everyone will feel this way. So a festival, therefore, can be understood as a space of intensification of imagined communities. It's something we create in our mind. We feel connected, we feel we belong, we feel we're part of this community. So it's a space where participants negotiate, but can also challenge how they feel they belong, and how they feel that this is their place and or their community. But investment in festivals takes place in the context of Australian regional and rural communities facing a range of complex challenges. So social, cultural, environmental, and economic transition, adaptation and decline, which I'll talk about shortly. And the COVID-19 pandemic and changing climate conditions have only exacerbated, have only made this more difficult. So,
Professor Duffy.
Yes.
Okay. You overall explain about the role of a festival and the effect of a festival. Let me ask you one question. Okay, our students are pretty much familiar with technology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you are explaining now the festival, but what do you think about the role of technology in festival or for festival? Which is festival has become so important for economics.
Yeah,
but
sure.
we have to the audience and visitors bring back to again their festival for economy or for jobs, whatever. Okay, what do you think about the connection with the festival and technology?
Yes, now that was something I was going to get to towards the end of the discussion.
Okay.
And so would you like me to continue or do you want me to address that? Yeah, so I wanted to talk about regional festivals here and how things like climate change and COVID-19 have changed the way we think about festivals, and that technology is something, we see these hybrid events, we see, particularly during COVID for the arts communities, lockdown had a serious impact for them, for their livelihoods. What we started to see were online events and hybrid events as we're moving supposedly out of this COVID pandemic. So we're seeing festivals where it can be online, so you can actually engage and interact online, but you can also perhaps attend these events. So we're seeing a shift in the way these are happening. It does, my work particularly looks at smaller regional towns. So there is the question of, do they have access to the technology and the funding for this sort of technology? And do their participants have access to that as well? So there's various things to think about. I will talk about in a minute where, as you'd be aware, a culturally diverse country, and that raises issues as well. Even with technology, how do we open up to audiences whose first language perhaps isn't English, because our national language is English, but we're seeing a wide range of different languages here as well. So does that start to address that question that we'll get to? Would you like me to continue with the lecture? Does that help?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So when I'm thinking about what we'll talk about today, I thought I'd define festivals. For me, that's really important in how then that's integrated into these communities and places. I'm going to talk specifically about regional festivals, and I have a couple of examples I'd like to focus on. And then toward the last part, I'd like us to open up discussion, with the group around what we might think of as the future of festivals, and touching on that question of technology, which I think is really important in opening up audiences here. Given Australia, most people live along the coast, most people live around major capital cities. So what does that mean for the populations who live in those remote, rural and regional areas? So that's the focus of my talk. And I can see someone's put up a chat question. I'm sorry, it's in Korean, and I'm sorry, I don't.
Oh, okay, just ignore it.
Just ignore it?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Okay. So as I said, this is what our topic is going to be. And I'd really like to acknowledge the work undertaken with my colleague Judith Mayer. We've spent quite a long time looking at regional festivals here in Australia. So what is a festival? Today's festivals, as you're probably aware, have their origins in historical religious celebrations and public cultural practices. So events like religious pilgrimages and feast days such as Holi, Carnival and the Day of the Dead purposely separate the time and space of festivals from that of everyday life. And these events are explicitly geographical activities. So they're in place. And again, connecting to that idea of technology, what does that mean when you're in a virtual space? So festivals here tend to be that geographical basis. You go to a particular place. But as we've already mentioned, technology is actually unpacking that quite a lot. So these activities connect places through participants' travels and pathways across regions, countries, and even continents, as well as the ways in which specific cultural landscapes are constructed around certain places and activities. So there's something about the physicality of these places that's important in the ways we've been thinking about festivals. So festivals serve to formulate space, time, and behavior. And again, thinking about what does that mean when we're thinking about technology? So there's this idea that you're in a place at a particular time and you behave in certain ways. So while strongly connected to the rhythms of daily life, where festivals are originating from, festivals are about distinguishing these activities from everyday events. So it's about making them something special. Their function is to bring groups and communities together in order to mark out particular religious, socio-political, and historical affiliations. So a festival tends to support notions of boundedness to particular places and people. There's this idea that you're in place with these people for these specific activities. And it's about producing this idea of unity for the group, that we're all here together, we can see each other in this place. So these notions of a coherence are created through a heightened sense of belonging, which is brought about by rituals and associated symbolic practices, be they religious or secular. So there's something about perhaps the clothing that people wear, the sorts of music, the sorts of food that's available, the activities you do. So again, keeping in mind, what does this mean then in an online environment, or how do we use technology perhaps in different ways to maybe continue these forms of festivals, but maybe it's opening up other ideas. So as a geographer, my work is attentive to the locations in which festivals take place and the ways these events create notions of community. And again, this is a significant component of tourism development. As we've already said, I'm very interested in the socio-cultural aspects of festivals, especially because festivals in Australia have proliferated in response to a range of social and planning policies that encourage participation and encounters with each other. So there's something about being face to face. And these policies and strategies are about how do we get people together face to face. And there's a specific reason why. This focus has its origins in this country's increasing cultural diversity since the 1970s. This is when we start to see larger numbers of refugees, asylum seekers and immigrants from places other than the UK and Western Europe starting to arrive. So we see this increased cultural diversity. And I want to talk about this shift towards a more culturally diverse population because this has implications as to how urban and regional demographic differences have been constructed through policy and the lived experiences of people. So again, I'm thinking very much at the moment about these face-to-face interactions and why we have what we have here in Australia. So policies of multiculturalism are associated with the ideas of tolerance, recognition, and the accommodation of minority rights. Originally, it was a formal policy focused on the settlement of recent migrants, especially those of non-English speaking backgrounds. Australian multiculturalism sought to protect people against racism and discrimination, as well as the protection of common citizenship rights. Since then, successive federal governments have on the whole maintained this initial set of ideals, but there's been some reshaping. In reality, Australian multiculturalism is framed mainly around the broader societal acceptance of the cultural rights of minority groups within a mainstream society. So that's a dominant society of, particularly from the UK, so a white community here in Australia. But this changed in 2017 when the Turnbull-led coalition government, which is a conservative government, shifted the policy's focus to that of the obligations of citizens and new arrivals and what they can contribute to Australia. So rather than the federal government being responsive to the needs of a culturally diverse population, the management of cultural diversity is now the work and responsibility of local government authorities. So we're seeing that shift of where this responsibility lies. In general, this work generally is about the management of difference within spaces of high diversity, which is more often than not located in urban areas, and more specifically the capital cities of Australian states and territories. The shaping of these festivals is achieved through official discourses by those groups controlling the festival, so be that local government authorities or other organisations. These discourses operate to produce an official imagined community that the festival is planned to address. So there's this idea that we're culturally diverse, and this festival is created to represent that cultural diversity. But there are real issues with that. It's done to minimise potentially negative attitudes and prejudices that may be held by majority groups in the community. So what we see in these festivals is the prominence of heritage and cultural traditions that are showcased, as well as the ways in which these events are promoted in the media and local government news. And they serve to reinforce these imagined communities of cultural diversity. However, notions of tolerance and accommodation are problematic and have rightly been critiqued because there's an assumed dominant social group who allows or permits this difference. So that's a real issue when we're looking at these sorts of festivals. The other issue to think about is that these multicultural festivals are predominantly urban-based, which perhaps is unsurprising as migrant settlement patterns tend to be found in Australia's national capitals and their suburbs, where there are opportunities for employment, housing, education, and connections to communities that are already there. But more recent settlement policies and strategies have sought to address the demand for less skilled labour in regional economies. So we're seeing a shift in where these migrant populations are moving. And also it's helping to assist humanitarian entrants to achieve early employment. So it's again about supporting these migrants into the Australian economy. So we have an example of immigrants from East Africa who arrive in Australia via different programs. So we have the humanitarian programs, we have a family migration scheme, and we have a skills migration scheme. And of course, regional places are benefiting. One example of such regional relocation is that of the Burundian community in northwest Victoria, which consists of many former farmers who fled civil war in Burundi. And they're now growing crops of traditional African maize near Mildura, so the north of the Victorian state. So this not only supports this community, but also brings different knowledges, these traditional farming practices to the broader community. So it's helping those second and third generation farmers who are addressing climate change. So there's a really interesting knowledge exchange happening in some of these communities. And indeed, regional towns now compete for these migrants, branding and promoting localities as beacons of economic opportunity, inclusivity, and this lifestyle of a rural idyll. So we start to see greater diversity in rural areas where communities have been motivated in part by regional immigration policies. And I'll return to this shortly. But just to provide a summary, from the Australian nation's perspective, multicultural festivals offer ways to manage diversity, to ensure a cohesive national identity, as well as encourage socio-economic benefits derived from tapping into the skills of potential migrants. From the perspective of migrant populations, festivals offer important opportunities to participate in meaningful activities that connect community members to their specific traditions and values. And festivals that focus on traditional performance and cultural practices also help increase opportunities for interaction between these diverse groups of people, with the goal of minimizing social isolation and facilitating greater understanding of difference. So again, this can feed into these economic opportunities. So this notion of encounter, of meeting difference, becomes important in these sorts of policies and discourses, that the time and space of the festival provides a common ground where civility and our collective sense of what may be called publicness are developed and expressed. Now, the idea of the other as a social group in a culturally diverse community has important implications for everyday life. Something that's not lost on local government authorities who use festivals in order to manage this diversity and at this local level. So festivals have become an established part of the repertoire of contemporary planning. Yet development of policy discourse focused on diverse community members needs to address the question, who has the right to public space? And this is really asking, who has the right to belong? So this is something Judith Mayer and I are really interested in, this social justice aspect of these public events. And I raise this question because the majority of festivals are held in public spaces. So we have parades, concerts, stalls and other activities are often held in streets and parks. And public spaces where the social and spatial relations that create community occur. So these relations serve to constitute, to create, and to regulate identity through categories such as race, class, gender, and sexuality. And festivals are used to frame and represent these relationships. Yet public space is a highly contested space. And again, this is something for us to consider when we're looking at technology as a public space. It's a very contested space. How do you manage this in public space, whether it's face-to-face or virtual? And I think that's a really important question we are starting perhaps to really consider. So we have perceived or real fears about certain groups within public space. So there's a fear of crime, of violence and terrorism and racial intolerance. And this can lead to some groups feeling very uncomfortable and even excluded. And public spaces where groups and communities can also protest, can object or call issues into focus and seek to bring about change. So festivals, I think, are really interesting because they have this paradoxical function in community life. On the one hand, the underlying focus is on the celebration of ideas about community with the goal of creating or enhancing social cohesion and these notions of belonging. But on the other hand, there's simultaneously sites of subversion and protest, offering opportunities to radically reinvent and reshape social relations, and so to what is meant by community. And again, thinking about this in terms of virtual reality, we do this in real life. We have particular ways we represent who we are, but virtual spaces offer new ways to project who we are, to project how we belong. So again, this is something for us to think about in this sort of perhaps tourism context. So with these ideas about urban festivals in mind, I'd like to turn to the role of festivals in rural life. So the term regional is used in various ways to define certain territories, often used colloquially, I can't say that word, often used, in everyday context, excuse me, at least in an Australian context. The idea of regional may be used to indicate those places outside of major and mostly capital urban areas. Officially, defining regional places tends to focus on population and distance from global hubs or centres. And these quantifiable measures are used to inform government policy and strategies. So it's about, okay, what's lacking in these places and how might we address this lack? So regional covers diverse landforms, ecosystems, economies, and ways of living. And within this broader category, we use different terms to describe and capture these differences. So we have in Australia these finer grained terms. So we have things like remote, rural, peri-urban, very remote, outer and inner regional. And again, it's in relation to capital cities. How far are these spaces from these capital cities where the economies perhaps are denser, where there's infrastructure available? So these more, these more quantifiable approaches to defining these non-urban places are necessary because we have to think about the strategic and logistical decision-making at state and federal levels. The problem is this presents a very limited view of regional life and so obscures the more complex and nuanced ideas of lives and livelihoods in these places. And again, this is something for us to think about. I'm not sure what it's like in South Korea, but here in Australia with COVID, people realised they didn't have to live in these major urban areas. They could actually engage in employment from a distance, again, through technology. So again, this is really interesting for us to consider. So while acknowledging the debates around how we conceptualize and define regions and rural places, this idea of the rural is very much part of an imagined place that stands in opposition to ideas about urban places. And in this rural imaginary, discussions about what a rural place is invariably focus on things like notions of spatial location, of inhabiting particular bounded spaces that are perhaps easily located on a map and at a distance from major urban and metropolitan centres. So again, I guess I'm speaking as a geographer, but it's something about there's a real place and we can point to it on a map. And popular imagery often focuses on this idea of the rural idyll. That's an escape from the stresses of modernity. Even so, certain landscapes are deeply embedded in what it means to be Australian. So I've just got a couple of images there that are taken around Australia, which resonates with this idea of, okay, what's the rural here in this country? And these are deeply embedded in what we think we are as Australian, even though we are highly urbanised. When we're thinking about Australia, these are the sorts of images that come to mind. So the rural is often positioned on the national scale as a symbolic site for authentic national values. So we think that's who we are. That's how we're representing ourselves. In Australia, as in the United Kingdom and North America, such deeply held imaginaries are complicated by conflicting representations and narratives that range from these ideas of struggle and hardship and the loss of youth to the city who are seeking a better life, through to images of idyllic vistas of ocean views or bush retreats that, even while far enough from the pace and smog of the city, nonetheless allow us to maintain the comforts of good wine, good coffee, and good food. So there's these really conflicting and very diverse ways that we think this rural imaginary is. Now, what's important in terms of the work I've been doing, these imaginaries, these rural idylls, are significant drivers of amenity-led migrants. So more commonly described as tree or sea change in Australia, it's this movement of people into certain non-urban locations, particularly regions of peri-urban development as well. So those areas that are entering into the rural, but they're sort of part of that suburban sprawl. So these imaginaries also suggest that regional and rural places are experienced, understood, and constituted not as separate and bounded locations, but they're actually very intimately connected with urban places in their economic, social, and cultural ways. So they're not distinct, even though we think of them this way. And again, that's something for us to pick up perhaps at the end of towards the end of the seminar. How has technology perhaps raised questions about this very distinct idea we have here in Australia in particular about urban and rural places? As Keith Hafferkrey, a geographer from the UK argues, a rural locality may have an agricultural backdrop, but its key spatial practices are consumption-oriented: leisure, residence, counter-urbanisation, dwelling, contemplation. And this formal representation tends to be some version of this rural idyll. So again, it's this complicated idea we have about these spaces. And these consumption-oriented practices underpin regional development strategies, and festivals are commonly incorporated into these strategies. So I just want to talk a little bit about the challenges when we're thinking about these places and using festivals, for example, as development practices. Around 2/3 of Australia's export earnings come from regional industries. Nonetheless, regional economic decline is a significant issue for Australia as for elsewhere. So we have a combination of challenges. We have dwindling populations in these rural areas. We have limited employment opportunities. We have changes in the predominant industry of agriculture. So we're seeing these changes in these traditional practices, as well as an evolving mining and resources sector and global competitive forces. And we have concerns about climate change and the environmental impacts of these mining industries. And all of this requires adaptation. The adaptation that's commonly used is from this resource-based economy and towards a service-based economy with a particular reliance on tourism and hospitality. So that goes back to my opening point. You know, almost half of every tourism dollar that we have, half of every dollar that we have here in Australia owes its sources in tourism. And this is where festivals have become a really popular tool. So I just want to talk about some of these development strategies. And perhaps as you're already aware, Richard Florida's idea of creative industries framework has become an important framework for conceptualizing the role of festivals in local economic development. Now, originally Florida's work focused on urban places, but we're starting to see this come into these rural areas as well. So festivals are understood as part of a range of cultural activities that attract the so-called creative classes into economically depressed areas. And the idea is that they help initiate regeneration through a cultural economy. As a result, festivals and tourism can bring about not only improved economic prospects, but also this idea of increased vibrancy and livability for communities. So again, it's very place-based. It's very much we are here all together in these spaces. Vibrancy and livability are also integral to the rise of the experience economy, where in developed countries at least, people find themselves not only with sufficient income, but with additional disposable income, which then affords them the ability to participate in more leisure activities. And so this in turn feeds into that heightened emotional experience in and with places and communities. So again, I think that's a really important thing for us to consider, this idea of the experience economy. What does it mean when we add technology to tourism? What might that look like? So this investment in festivals takes place in the context of Australian regional and rural communities facing complex challenges of social, cultural, environmental, and economic transition. which COVID-19 and changing climate conditions have only exacerbated, have only made more difficult for these communities. The economic impact was felt really early during the pandemic, with 255,000 arts events cancelled at a loss of 280 million Australian dollars as early as the 24th of March in 2020, so very early in that pandemic period. COVID-19 and the recent period of natural disasters in Australia. So we've had the fires 2019, 2020. Now we're going through these issues of La Nina and flooding events, and that's having a serious impact as well. So this is having a severe impact on the livelihood of practitioners, of stakeholders, and those employed in associated industries. But it's also demonstrated how deeply intertwined arts, culture and economies are. So again, thinking about this in terms of technology, how do we tap in to the importance of these face-to-face experiences? How do we, is that important? How do we ensure that we perhaps use technologies to enhance the important implications of festivals? So lockdowns and social distancing have meant radical changes to everyday life, and this has placed the creative industries under immense economic pressure. So this is the context for examining the role played by festivals in regional locations. And so Judith and I I've mentioned already, have explored festivals in a number of regional and peri-urban regions in New South Wales and Victoria. And we're thinking about the possible significance of these events for regenerating and reimagining regional community life. So our interest lies in how festivals may or may not provide equal access to any of the benefits that derive from staging arts and cultural events. So does it provide equal access, which I think is a really important point when we're thinking about technology and how it might support these sorts of events. So in our framing of the festival as part of such a strategy for regeneration or economic development, the festival is integral to not only economic benefits, but also issues of politics and social justice, because it's understood as an important site for facilitating social and economic relations, keeping in mind that these relations can also actively exclude certain groups and individuals, even though this may not be the intention. Geographers Ruth Fincher and Kurt Iveson point out that festivals are increasingly being mobilised by urban authorities in the service of place marketing. So again, they're geographers, so it's very much about place. But it's something that also has become an attractive strategy in non-urban places. For many small towns, festivals are a way to boost tourism, either by packaging and marketing existing festivals to be more suitable for visitors, so thinking about the audience, who are they trying to bring in, or by creating new festivals to attract tourists and the economic impact that these tourists bring. And again, this is something that is perhaps exciting about technology. How can it tap into these ideas about developing tourism? But this use of festivals in regional places can be challenging because of assumptions about both the regional location as an homogenous community, that everyone's the same, and how festivals may contribute to these changing communities and places. As with other parts of the minority world, so the developing world, and even before the developed world, and even before the COVID-19 pandemic, Australia has been seeing an increased number of people seeking to escape the city. This idea of going back to the land in search of more affordable homes, a better quality of life, or just a change of scenery. Now, while there's variation in the types of people who are moving out of the cities, a notable number of these migrants are early retirees with greater affluence, greater mobility. So they have the capital to be able to move, whether it's economic or cultural capital. And this movement of affluent in-migrants to rural areas has led to significant changes in the makeup of rural towns and villages, along with bringing in their diverse interests and intentions towards these places. But we need to think about location more carefully as a significant factor in demographic change. With the boom in city populations and the associated urban sprawl, in the Australian context, the impetus for change for many is less a rush away to the countryside and more about these dreams of home ownership and a life in the suburbs. And this has led to housing development at that rural-urban interface. So we're starting to see really interesting things happening in places that perhaps were understood as rural, as these a greater number of urban residents are moving at that space. So we're finding that these demographic changes are driving complex and far-reaching processes of economic, social, cultural, and even land use change. And these changes are often most evident in the different standards of living between wealthy in-migrants and long-standing residents with lower socioeconomic status. And as a result, we see social tensions increasing. Now, again, we're sort of in the middle of this happening. So again, thinking about technology, how might this actually support better social justice? How might technology support increasing those who are at perhaps a lower socioeconomic status? How might that improve their standard of living, their employment capacity? So I want to talk about two particular rural places to explore in more detail the changes that I've been talking about and how festivals have been used to address these changes. Now, the first is the Yakubu Festival. This is derived from an Aboriginal word meaning place of green pasture, and it started in the mid-1970s as a community festival. It's held in a place called Pakenham. This was an area originally part of the territory of the Bunurong tribe. And when the festival started, Pakenham was a really small country town. The industries were mostly dairy and cattle sales. And to the north of the settlement, there were apple orchards established. They've gone now with urban redevelopment. Pakenham also had a very small population, a very low density. Even in 1966, the census recorded a population of 1,680 people. And around 20 years later, that had only increased by around 500 people. So you have a large area with a very low density of people engaged in agriculture. As the organisers of the festival we interviewed explained, the festival was set up to offer a time and place for people living in a sparsely populated area to come together and celebrate their rural lives. Now, in the late 1960s, Pakenham was part of a growth corridor of planned urban expansion. It's located 57 kilometres east of Melbourne CBD, and it became a commuter suburb, especially when the suburban electric train services were established in the mid-1970s. So the festival started just before all these changes. So what I'd like to do is just show a video of around 2 minutes. It's from a news item which talks about the festival. It's from 2017. So hopefully this will work.
Okay.
The Yakubu Festival in Pakenham is an annual event which is designed to bring the community together to showcase what each and everyone has to offer. It's something that everyone in the town now looks forward to every April. Mayor of Cardinia Shower, Councillor Brett Owens, says the festival is a way of keeping the old-fashioned, friendly nature of yesteryear.
So Yakubu's been going for over 40 years. It's a community-run festival, celebrates our community, our achievements. It's based on Mr. Yakubu, which is a mythical creature. It's a bit like a bunyip. So it brings the community together. As you saw, a lot of kindergarten schools, community organisations come together. They have floats. They celebrate their activities. They promote what they're doing.
Bonnie Medley runs one of the market stalls here and says she loves the inclusiveness of the festival.
I had a restaurant for 3 years. My landlord put my rent up and I had to do something else. I found this business for sale and I took it on. It was quite run down. And yeah, I've built it up, and a festival like this just brings out families, which is what it's about, and so multicultural. It's wonderful that everybody's partaking in the day.
While Pakenham has seen enormous growth in the past few years, this festival has managed to maintain the town's close-knit community feel.
I think it's really good. I think they should do this more often, and it just showcases, I think, a lot of things that we have around in the locality. It's getting everyone out and about. That's pretty good, I think, for on a nice weekend, lovely and sunny. We should do it more often.
Riley Glacken for Mojo News.
So this is a festival originally created by the local authority, and it was a way to bring members of the local community together. Mr. Yakubu, which is a very strange creature, is name given to a bunyip-like creature originally created by school children in Pakenham. Why this particular creature is less clear. The bunyip is a mythical creature originating in Aboriginal mythology that lives in swamps and riverbeds and waterholes. So perhaps it connects to the region's terrain and local stories. So it is a swampy area. So perhaps that's where that's come from, but it's not very clear why. The region around Pakenham, and in particular the areas in which the Casey Cardinia growth corridor is located, so this is part of that growth corridor from Melbourne, lies between streams and drainage lines that channel water from the upland area just north of the town. And much of what was designated swampland was reclaimed about 25 years ago. Although it is still prone to flooding, and sometimes when you drive through at night there's a really eerie mist. So again, it sort of fits in with this mythology of a creature living there. So the impetus behind the festival was a small group of local residents who wanted to celebrate their rural community. Yakubu prides itself in providing a free festival for the people, by the people, and it's the people volunteering their time in Yakubu who are positioned as the heart and soul of the event. As one participant we interviewed explained, festivals like Yakubu are the glue that holds communities together. The Yakubu community, just put the next slide up, sorry, so you can see what I'm saying. Sorry about that. So festivals like Yakubu are the glue that holds communities together. It's become part of making new residents feel welcome. It's the vehicle for new residents to work and play beside established residents. It's about celebrating our strong, cohesive and well-functioning community and local business. Now, however, the Yakubu Festival finds itself in a rapidly growing peri-urban area, and it's quickly become part of an outer suburban part of Melbourne. So it's no longer that rural feel, even though you will see that harking back to that history. As you see in one of the pictures there in the middle, there's always lots of tractors being presented. So that's that historical connection. Pakenham currently has a population of just under 60,000, and it's forecast to grow to around 95,000 by 2041. And what was once a rural place of farms is now enveloped in high-density suburban sprawl. And this is also impacting on the demography. In terms of cultural diversity as measured by ideas of ethnicity, there's been an increase in numbers of residents born overseas and those speaking a language other than English. So it includes India, Sri Lanka and the Philippines. So we're seeing this change in demography. But the largest numbers of overseas arrivals remain the United Kingdom and New Zealand. Now, the format of the festival hasn't changed substantially since it started. It has a range of components, including the street parade, as we saw in the video, which is probably the best known part of the festival. And we saw street markets, a fun fair, fireworks. There's also a twilight carnival. However, as the nature of the local community changes, questions are being asked as to how well this festival actually represents and is inclusive of those who are moving into the town. Support for the festival has waxed and waned over time to such an extent that the future of the festival has been uncertain. A key concern constantly raised in local media and council documents is how to ensure a sense of community is valued and facilitated given these changes. At the time of our study, the festival organising committee had remained broadly unchanged. Now, this naturally has benefits. The committee is very experienced. It's very well known. It's connected within the community, and the festival generally runs smoothly because of this. But the members of the committee are ageing, and there appeared to be a lack of younger volunteers who are actually going to step in and do this work as well. But we can see from the video, this has changed as younger council representatives are elected. There's also been suggestions that this existing committee is perhaps a little set in their ways, and they find it difficult to acknowledge with the festival the changing nature of the local area. And perhaps they're failing to appreciate that for many new residents, a rural agricultural festival may not represent their place. So they may not feel that this is their community. So these are really interesting questions to think about as well. If we examine the relationship between the festival and the local closely, local governments and community groups tend to focus on geographical location, as I've mentioned a number of times. So it's a very place-based idea of community. And this makes sense given the mandate of local councils and authorities to be responsible for a particular bounded geographical place, even if the boundaries of that place shift over time with changes to the actual local authority and who they're representing. So we see the festival embedded along these traditional lines of an ideal community. So it's characterised by small-scale personal ties, often going back many years or even generations. So it's about representing this past. The other thing, and again, this ties to these ideas of technology and tourism, the focus on place when considering community is that the community is actually constituted in more ways than simply location. It's not just where we live, where we reside. We have to think about our interests, our shared values, or our levels of attachment, how we connect to others through interest, where we've come from before, perhaps. So there are these multiple ways we connect to a community. But thinking about the rural origins, as one person interviewed explained that he and I've got in the quote here, that festivals like Yakubu are this glue, but he probably liked it better 10 years ago before it got so big. He knew every person or most people in Pakenham. He doesn't know that now. Before he could walk up the street and he'd know people, but now he doesn't know everyone. So again, there's this really interesting set of questions around who belongs and how do we connect that belonging. So given that people in general are seen to be perhaps less community-minded than in the past because of those different connections, this is seen as a key ingredient and strength of the festival. These traditions perhaps are meaningful to particular community groups and accord with the history of particular traditions and points of view. But we're seeing these divergent views between this official take and the on-the-ground community view. For example, although the festival has been intended to be representative of the broader Shire, the broader local authority area, it's often considered to be a festival of the town of Pakenham. So it dilutes the importance of the rural settlements around the town, as well as the urban populations moving in. And this was borne out when we looked, when we did our work a few years ago. It appeared to be a really strong reflection of this older identity of the town. So the local schools, the Country Fire Authority, the St John's Ambulance all took part. And they play a very important part in Pakenham and Cardinia Shire. Yet, in spite of the strong presence of local community groups, when we could see that again in the video, we're seeing this diversity being represented in the audience. It's difficult to see any major contribution from the new growth areas during the parade. So we do see some divergence in the 2017 video, but these are changes that are occurring slowly. So, just So the festival, though, isn't simply about presentation or representation of a community's identity. There's also this idea of exchange, a process by which those involved may actively acknowledge these encounters and contribute to the formation of the festival. And again, this is interesting for us to think about in terms of technology. How might that enhance or perhaps inhibit these important exchanges, these encounters? So this quote I have in this slide here was from a manager of a large supermarket. And he said, look, I suppose with the festival, it was all new to me. I've been at the Shire 10 months. And when I arrived, a few months later, I was introduced to Yakubu and I went, Yaka what? But I thought the event was absolutely magnificent to really touch base with the community. That's what we want to do. I suppose our point is, how can we give a little back to the community? And when you look at this festival, it's giving something back. So again, there's something about this exchange that's really important. So this is in a face-to-face context. What might that mean for a technological input? Mobility studies literature suggests that when festivals are used instrumentally for public policy objectives, such as increasing social cohesion, there's an underlying assumption that the festival has clear and widely understood links to a bounded sense of place and community. But more than that, the focus is often the resident community that's embedded in the location. So again, there's something about that link between people and place. They're very intimately connected. It's not thinking about how do we move beyond those sort of boundaries. So what appears to be missing is a focus on how different approaches to an understanding of social relations are incorporated into the festival. It's more than just necessarily face-to-face. We also need to think about where these policies are located. So this particular Shire Council doesn't have a specific events policy. Rather, festivals and events are subsumed within their arts and cultural policy. So this has important implications for how these are perhaps managed and supported. And again, where does technology fit into local authority policy? How is it being used? Is it being underused, for example? So it's not uncommon for local authorities to include events under a range of different policies. We find them in tourism, in economic development, and even community development portfolios. So this highlights a difficulty faced by small community events. They have no home within a council structure. And this can sometimes lead to them falling between the cracks in terms of official council policy. So who's supporting them? Who's there arguing for the significance of having these events? So the stakeholders of the event are aware of the potential tensions relating to the festival and its past, its presence and its future. And they're taking steps to try and better engage with these new communities living in the area. For example, the organising committee has been taking Mr. Yakubu on a tour around local schools, including those built in the new housing estates on the outskirts of Pakenham. And they want to build up this enthusiasm, especially with the children. So they're thinking it may just be a matter of time before these children become part of the festival, and this might bring about all sorts of changes in thinking about how they feel they belong. But it's worth noting that those people moving into new suburbs are already dealing with major changes in their daily lives. So they're settling into new homes, into new workplaces. They may or may not have long commutes. So they've got a lot to think about. So it could be argued that in such busy lives, becoming involved in community traditions may be a really low priority. Additionally, there remains a degree of resistance to change among the longer-term residents who feel that any alterations to our festival should be minimised. So again, we see these conflicts. The second example I'd like to talk about is that of amenity-led migration in particular into the New South Wales rural town of Dungog. Now, this is a small country town. It's located not far from where I am at the moment, about an hour's drive north, and it's approximately 3 hours drive north of Sydney. So it's within, driving distance if you wanted to go on a tourism event. in the Shire of Dungog, so it's very confusing. There's the town of Dungog and the local authority is called Dungog as well. But in the Shire, the main population centres are the towns of Dungog, Gresford, Paterson, Vasey and Clarence Town. Prior to European colonisation, this region was home to the Wonnarua people with rights and responsibilities associated with caring for country, attributed to a number of tribal and clan groups. So in the example, I'm going to explore the impact of amenity-led migration on this particular rural place and how different ideas about the rural can influence the construction of festivals. And in this place, there are two particular festivals, the Dungog Film Festival, which I'll talk about first, and the more recently created Dungog Festival. So I'm going to show this short promotion, which was from 2007. So it was promoting the beginning of the Dungog Film Festival. And I'd like us to think about how this place is represented. There's some really interesting ways it draws on this rural idyll, that this is a beautiful place. It's you know, it's back to the country. It's a beautiful scenery, but it's also tapping into, it's a film festival, the quirkiness that Australia is often represented in films that Australians put together. So I'll just show this video.
A bunch of people in this town have decided to put on a film festival at the James Theatre. It's real ancient. Mum said it's the oldest in the whole of Australia. Hi, my name's Georgia Burns, and that's my friend Kitty, and we live in Dungog. At school, they say Dungog means Aboriginal for a place of thinly wooded hills. That's Ken. He runs the James Theatre. He's also the projectionist. He's almost as ancient as the cinema. There's Luke. He's Ken's apprentice, and he's 13 and has a huge crush on Kate Blanchett. Sarah works in the candy bar and makes the choc tops. I reckon they're awesome. That's her mum and dad. They've been helping out at the cinema forever. They told me that this festival's only going to show Australian movies. Sarah loves soccer and movies. She wants to be a film director when she grows up and tell Aussie stories. Trevor was a bricklayer before he retired and became a champion cross-stitcher. He's on the James Theatre committee. They make very important decisions, like when they voted to have a violet crumble choc top. Trevor and Edna have been married for 57 years. His favourite movie is Strictly Boring. Edna's is Chopper. Sparrow's Dungog's only taxi driver. He remembers all the words from the castle, but has to write on his hand to remember other things. Tom knows everything about everything, and he reckons we should all watch more Aussie movies. Margaret had her picture on the front of Dungog Chronicle when she had triplets. She helps out with the op shop and lots of other things. She reckons movie people would like Dungog Serenity. Glenn's the mayor. His favourite movie is The Cars That Ate Paris. He just wants everyone that comes here to have a bonza time. And that's Alana. She's the festival director. She believes Dungog's the most beautiful place on earth. That's why she's having the festival here. Well, that's some of the people making this festival, and that's my little story about my town, Dungog.
So it's a very clever way of promoting this particular town, and the use of film and is very sophisticated, even though it's presented, you know, as this quaint little place. the use of film technology, I think, is really well done here. So it gives you a particular sense, drawing on all sorts of tropes about Australia and rural places. It refers to particular Australian films all the way through it. So it's a very clever promotional tour. So this older festival was held between 2007 and finished in 2012, and was initiated to support and preserve the James Theatre. This was built in 1918, and it's promoted as the oldest still operating purpose-built cinema in Australia, and it still operates now. It was decided that a festival offered a means to contribute towards the renovation and upkeep of this historic venue. The running of the festival was done by two filmmakers originally from Sydney. So Alana Zitzerman, who we saw there, and Stavros Katsididis. They both relocated to Dungog, so they're amenity-led migrants themselves, and they wanted to foster a greater appreciation for Australian film among Australian audiences. They wanted to strengthen bonds between the Australian film and television communities, and use the festival and its location to showcase Australian films in Australian settings. So they've used, I guess, a particular form of technology to connect it to this particular place. And it's very interesting in the way they're thinking about community. It's not necessarily Dungog community. What they're doing is saying, this is a community connected to Australian film and television, and we're going to celebrate Australian film and television in this place because of all those sort of tropes that we think about of Australian rural places. So it's a very clever way of doing this. So it not only showcased feature films, short films, TV, documentaries, Australian classics and music videos, it also ran an extensive education program. So there were workshops and seminars, masterclasses with prominent directors, script readings for TV series, miniseries and feature films. The festival attracted a large audience. So in 2010, around 9,000 people came into Dungog, and this is a town that had just under 2,000 residents at the time. And interviewing people from that time, they were so excited. They had, you know, very well-known film people in the area, and they were very excited about everyone was wandering around the street. Now, while very successful in terms of attracting famous names in Australian film, the festival itself faced financial difficulties and ceased to operate in 2012. The organisers had asked the Dungog Shire Council for $20,000 to cover the cost of transporting VIPs and accommodating them. So this is a small town. I should say too, the first festival, they weren't expecting 9,000 people. They actually didn't have enough food. They didn't have enough accommodation. They had to sort of set up tents and all sorts of things for people to stay in. So there is that issue about amenities, what's available there, and infrastructure. So they wanted $20,000 to help cover costs of accommodating and bringing people in, plus rent-free use of the James Theatre and 2 other venues, and provision of volunteers, cleaning and electricity at no cost. Now, the council had no room in its budget for such an outlay. And in addition, long-term residents of Dungog were angry because they believed that the economic benefits of the film festival didn't come into the town. So by not paying not paying for cleaning and electricity, all these sorts of things, they weren't actually helping the industries located in the town. And residents felt that all the economic benefits were going to Sydney. A new festival was inaugurated in 2016, and it was simply called the Dungog Festival. But a component of this film festival remained, which was the street parade. I would just like to show you just a little bit of this, because it does resonate with the one we saw in Pakenham. So again, there's similarities in how people are representing their regional places. I'll just show you a very short bit.
Okay.
So that gives you a bit of a sense. So it resonates very similar to the previous festival. I don't know what community festivals are like in South Korea, but this is so typical of a street parade here in a rural town. You know, everyone has a tractor. There's always a tractor. There's always horses or donkeys, all sorts of interesting things. So this festival was run by the community, and it was run primarily by volunteers. By 2018, when I went to this festival, along with the street parade, they had a long table dinner, they had a sculpture exhibition, they did continue having a range of films at the James Theatre. There were things like a country garden ramble, so you could go to people's gardens and have a look. There was a street party and dash hound racing, which was quite interesting. I'll just put the next slide up, sorry. So one significant change was the expanded location of the festival. So rather than focus just on Dungog, the town, the revised festival included the other towns within the Shire. So the sculpture on the farm was at Fosterton. Wallaroba had a hall where they had a German-themed cuisine and refreshments, and it's also where the dash hound racing was happening. So participants in this study explained that this reimagining of the festival was overtly about attracting new people into both the town and the region of Dungog. So they wanted to ensure that local businesses would remain and flourish, and that the tourism industry offers an important opportunity to do this. But beyond this instrumentalist view of festivals, we uncovered competing claims and values attributed to this festival, even as those directly involved in running the festival comprised a really dense and tight network of people. So it's a small population, but those involved in running the festival actually had different ideas about what it was about. So our analysis of the material from this festival revealed a number of ways the place of Dungog was imagined. So we had this idea of an idyllic place, that it's stuck in the past, that it's a place to raise a family, it's a place that needs help. And we chose a place framing approach to make sense of how the place of Dungog was visualised by residents. And it allowed us to conceptualise these different perceptions and images, which were created by differing groups of people within the same rural community. So again, going back to that assumption that rural places are homogenous. They're not. Even coming from a similar background, you'll have different ideas about what's going on. So we revealed three important frames. One framing immediately evident related to the longer term residents of the town, those who were born and bred in the area. Their town had always been associated with farming from the early days of dairy and timber in the late 19th century until the gradual decline in economic importance of farming in the late 1980s. So for them, it's a farming community. However, following the decline in the agricultural sector, a new group of people moved into the area, and this is the amenity-led migrants who brought very different ideas of Dungog. The filmmakers who initiated the film festival is just one example, but more recent in-migration continues to attract those connected to the arts industry. For example, Philippa Graham, who founded the not-for-profit Sculpture on the Farm as a component of the Dungog Festival and first held in 2018. And that's a really interesting component because again, it's drawing on bringing in people from Sydney, from elsewhere, to come and be involved in this particular activity. With higher levels of both education and affluence, these amenity-led migrants seek the aesthetic value and the lifestyle that a rural place can offer. These incomers were strongly focused on bringing their ideas of art and culture as a mechanism to reinvigorate the local art scene and viewed the festival as a way to enhance the vibrancy of the local community. So again, we keep hearing this Florida-related idea that the creative arts are going to bring about all these sorts of changes. Finally, there are those whose remit is to bring economic development into the area in lieu of the lost opportunities in agriculture. Their framing of the town and the Shire more broadly and the role of the festival relates very strongly to the ability of the festival to bring in tourists. So it's about bringing people in. And that's to shore up limited livelihood options and create a positive image of the area for future visitors and perhaps future residents. And again, we can see perhaps the value that technology might bring here. So many of those we interviewed chose to be involved in the festival because of a strong sense of commitment to the Dungog community and wanted to support its future. It meant ensuring the economic viability of the town. And one key point of interest is the fact that Indigenous voices are almost completely absent from any place that was identified here. And indeed, only one person actually referred to Indigenous people. So again, this comes back to those social justice ideas, and more specifically, who belongs and who has the right to belong. So examining how we might address these questions draws on the notion of the right to the city, first examined by Henri Lefebvre, a Marxist French scholar. He argued that lived space is not simply a passive stage on which social life unfolds, but represents an integral element of social life. So the right to the city refers not just a right to the physical space, but more broadly to rights of access, participation, and indeed a right to habitat and to inhabit. Now, again, I think this is really interesting for us to think about in terms of technology and the ways that we can inhabit virtual space, or how we can communicate through online ecologies, if you'd like to call them that. So Lefebvre's focus on the inhabitants of the city is an argument that membership of a community is earned by living out the routines of everyday life in the spaces of that community. Moreover, and of relevance to our examination of the role of festivals in rural places, Lefebvre argues that art is an important political component of inhabiting place. And he suggests that art is not about prettifying place through addition of works of art. So it's not just about decorative aspects, but art can become praxis and poiesis on a social scale, a doing and a beginning on changing our spaces. So in the work Judith and I have done, we suggest these ideas have important implications for social justice when we're looking at rural places, where increased mobility and migration are changing the composition of many rural and regional centres, bringing both welcome diversity and potentially less welcome intrusion into established ways of life. So a festival then offers a way to connect community and place, and so engage in embodied, experiential, affective and emotional activities and place-making practices that go into facilitating this idea of a right to that place. In the example of the Dungog Arts Festival, the diversity of opinions and ideas as to how a place should be represented are most evident in the ways that different groups of individuals emphasise or de-emphasise aspects of that place. And this can be done in service of furthering political and social agendas, or simply because people understand place in different ways. So the example of Dungog highlights how a festival can be a space for negotiation and contestation about what a place means to residents and visitors. Providing a memorable experience is not only a desirable outcome for festival organisers, but in fact provides a significant competitive edge. Festivals possess the opportunity for experiencing powerful and intoxicating qualities that are significant to sustaining and transforming social life. And this quality was exemplified in one of my earlier projects, where one interviewee explained that a festival changes the nature of the place where I conduct my life. Where I walk to pay bills or do the shopping becomes a place infused with memories of people dancing, playing music, sitting in the sunshine, chatting, meeting friends. It adds to the quality of life by adding a new dimension to what this place means to me. So again, thinking about what might technology contribute to this, I think is really important. So festivals then are, in addition to addressing economic concerns, sites of exploration and experimentation in the design of communities. because they function simultaneously as sites of social integration, cohesion, subversion, protest, and exclusion. They help us understand who we are and what we value by facilitating a range of opportunities for interaction and engagement that have significance beyond the festival's temporal and spatial bounds. So in the work I've been doing, what we're finding are the complex and at times competing roles attributed to regional festivals. So if we consider the role that festivals may play in strengthening or rearranging economic, environmental, social, embodied and cultural relations in communities within and beyond that event, we need to think about how these are also deeply political rearrangements, that they shape notions of who belongs and who doesn't. And there's always a potential for divisive outcomes. So in addition, we need to determine the value, the range and efficacy of networks in regional locations. They're necessary in order to reveal the variety of networks and relations that are present within and beyond a place. And again, this is where technology can be really important. So, acknowledging these sorts of networks is really important, and it draws on geographer Doreen Massey's idea that we need a more nuanced understanding of how we understand place, that it arises out of multiple connections, multiple trajectories of social and economic cultural relationships. However, as Blitchfield and Halkia point out, the flaw in development strategies is due to poorly understood spatial relations. As they argue, rural areas are facing the prospect of marginalisation and peripherality in an age of globalisation, where the attention of governments and media focuses increasingly on the lack of a competitiveness of urban and metropolitan regions. So this means that regional development planning requires thinking about how festivals need to accommodate not only the practices of placemaking that anchors the event within a location, but also how the event captures this incessant movement of mobile things, bodies, materials, ideas that interconnect to create the spaces of everyday life. So a festival really is better conceptualized as a network. It's networked within an assemblage that comprises mobility and various forms of stasis, and can better capture the fluidity of community formation and processes of identity and identification. So it's not just in-person, it's not just place-based. We have to think about those relationships beyond the place. So just some of the key points that I'd like to raise here. I'll just move this. So regional festivals are a significant component of tourism development tools here in Australia. They're embedded within these regional development research ethics and practices. They're integral to creating and negotiating how we make, how we frame, how we represent various relations between people and place. But to keep in mind, rural places are really complex sites. They're not isolated, but embedded in these ranges of networks. And here's just some references. I can send those through if people are interested. And what I wanted to do is just open up this discussion now around festivals in the future. I've just got 3 questions and I'm happy to open up the discussion more broadly, but I was just thinking, you know, in Australia, we have a particular distribution of the population. As I've said, with most living around capital cities. So what similarities or differences in terms of the role of festivals might you find in countries and places where you live? What other roles might there be for festivals when we're looking at tourism and tourism development? And what changes might technology bring to festivals and the tourism industry? So thank you very much for listening and for your attention.
Okay. Wow. Your lecture is very powerful and calm and strong. So actually, I'm very well instructor. Usually I interrupting the instructor's lecture. and then sudden question and then answer, and some people hate it. But anyway, today I cannot interrupt your lecture because your lecture is just like a elementary school teacher is straightforward and then very clear pronunciation to us. Anyway.
Oh,
so,
I'm glad it was clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very new things to us festival. Okay, students, if you have any question, do not hesitate.
I'll stop sharing there.
Okay.
I'm very happy to explain anything that I might not have spoken about clearly. That's
okay.
fine. That's fine.
Okay, let me ask my question to you first. A festival. We have a festival as well in Korea. We have an event, a mega event, and small conference, small events, and sort of things. So that's all activities probably the boundary of festival. But my expertise is about technology, smart tourism. So I'm always thinking about how we can be able to estimate the number of visitors to the festival, and how can we able to prove the number of visitors in the festival and the prediction for the next year, or target marketing who are highly interested in this festival. So my thinking is we need to categorize or identify who are in this festival, and using of technology, we probably we can be able to measure the number of people and then the economic value and ramification sort of things. So far you addressing is a role of technology for engaging the festival with the technology, but I want to hear from you how technology can be able to estimate or measure or investigate the number of people.
Yeah, that's a really that's a really tricky question. So that's something Judith and I have been thinking about for quite some time. We actually want to develop a tool where we can measure those different benefits, and technology can offer that. The trick is, for me, when I'm thinking about it, is one way, I guess, is ticketing. So even using something like Eventbrite, where you don't actually have to pay, but people register. So you've got a sense of perhaps numbers. In regional areas, it's a little bit different. So one festival I've done some work with is Booktown, which I know they have a Booktown in South Korea, a Booktown festival. And that's one that I'd really like to go to. So what's really interesting there is the way it's set up. They cut off the main street, which is a real issue for residents. And you have to pay a gold coin donation to get in, but residents find that really difficult because they're not benefiting from those economic, from that weekend where people are there spending their money. So how do we measure that difference? How might we demonstrate there's a difference there? So trying to think about a way that we can measure those impacts. And also with festivals, often we can get a sense of how much money perhaps is spent in a location, but that's not necessarily going to tell us how much was spent because of the festival. It also might not tell us necessarily the ongoing impacts of the festival. So someone might come to the festival and come back because of the festival a different time, because they were really interested in that location. So there's a temporal element to it as well. How do we measure the impact of the event ongoing? So that's a really tricky thing, and that's what we're trying to think through. One way we've been thinking of doing this is social network analysis. So looking at perhaps how relationships change which we can show before and after the festival, and we could do it that way. So there are a number of ways we can do it, but it is really hard, I think, to say, okay, because of this festival, we can demonstrate this amount of money was spent. We can have an idea, but again, you know, where do you stop saying that influence has happened, because it could be ongoing. I'm not sure if I've completely answered your question, but yeah, it's something we're trying to think about.
So social network analysis is one of the tools to, you know, measuring or investigating the number of people and also engagement for the future, the ongoing process. And okay, here in Korea, we're using this kind of the method, like a telecommunication. You know, everybody bring their smartphone. And the smartphone is, we have using chips. The chips is identifier and connecting to that the cellular area, the antenna. So the antenna is count on your individual chips.
Yeah.
So if you are in there, we can be able to identify who you are and the number of people. So we can measure how this event, a mega event or the festival, bring more people on this season or the period of the time. And also we also using of the credit card. The credit card, the people coming in here and using the credit card in town, and then they spend the money for that festival. So we can indirectly measure the number of people are spending money on that period. And then we can the difference measure between the ordinary days and the event days. So that as so the like a telecommunication, the big data, also credit card big data. And then also we can knock the door the tax, the government, then and then ask them to how much the extra money the entrepreneurs or shopping mall, and then they can get the money on the certain period of time. That's another, you know, the big data analysis. So three data sets is converged together to get the exact numbers and ramification economically, and then the identification of the personal.
Yeah,
it's but very hard.
It is. May I ask a question? With big data, how much private information? Because that's always been an issue.
That's another big problem in these days. The privacy is important. Is very subtle issue. So the like the telecom companies, they selling their data to the company but they delete the identification. So they delete the name and delete the very sensitive individual information. But they give the some identifier, something the identifier who cannot identify. But anyway.
Okay, because I guess I'm asking that because I don't know if you know, here in Australia we've had the major telecom Optus was hacked, and people's private data are out there now. So yeah, I mean they didn't. It was very poorly set up by the company itself. Like they didn't protect people's private details. But yeah, it's really interesting. Big data is fascinating. What we might find out and what we can do.
Any students?
I have a question.
Sure.
Hello.
Hello.
Professor Duffy. Yeah, I appreciate your lecture. In Korea, thanks to the transportation development, we have so many festivals actually in rural areas as well. And usually they're based on like their agricultural products. So they made some food with it, and then they make kind of museums like to produce that. And then recently, not from the DMOs, like usually from the influencers, the reason like management asked the influencers to like promote their festivals in advance. And so the influencers and the YouTubers make their own like promotion things and promote the festival before that festival like start. So is there any similar form of like marketing in Australia as well?
Yeah, that's a great point. Social influencers are really important in today, aren't they?
Yeah.
I guess what it's coming through in TikTok particularly. The issue too is because we've been in lockdown for so long, things are still just starting to open up, but social media is really important in the way people will say they're there. I haven't seen much in Australia around influencers, but it could be because only like this half of the year we've been able to go in person to festivals and sorts of events. But that's a really important thing to raise. You know, what influence are these influencers having on these spaces? So there'll be lots around YouTube clips, and lots of festivals, regional festivals will have a web page where they provide videos from the previous festival as part of that marketing. There is a festival down in Gippsland, which is a big festival over the New Year period, and that's very much embedded in social media. So people know it's on, and all sorts of things happen because of that social connection. So it's influence in that way. May I ask, with the influencing, does that feed back then into the festival? So the influencer might pick up, oh, they really like this aspect, or they don't like that aspect. Does the festival itself then perhaps respond to those suggestions?
Well, what I heard is that the festival, the management, they ask the influencers to make videos before they start the festivals, and they get a lot of comments from them, and then they like adjust some plans of it, and then when they have like good reactions from the video, they might like think that okay, this gonna be work for another people, so it's gonna be popular, so they like pay more attention on it, something like that.
So it's a really interesting partnership between the influencer and the festival organizer.
Yes.
That's really interesting. I'll have to look out for that. Thank you.
In Korea, so many videos and postings, so you can maybe like take a look at it.
Okay, thank you. I will. Thank you very much.
Good Q&A. Good. Next.
I have a question, Professor. Based on your lecture, what I understand is the local festival is the main purpose is to feel the cohesiveness between the residents, and I would like to know what is the and if the festival itself is going very well, I would like to know if the residents or the authority, they would like to expand it, like the bigger size of the festival. And in that cases, well, they can make a lot of profit, but the sense of togetherness, sense of belonging will be maybe fade away at some point. And for the in the regards of the online technological community, what would be the virtual geographical or the realm for the community? That I would like to know.
Yeah, thank you. They're great questions. So yes, there are a number of regional festivals that have got so big, they've had to relocate. So there's a folk festival that's held along the coast of Victoria, and it used to be the township. So you'd have the venues in the township, the street in the township, the football oval. That's where everything was held. And so it was a small coastal village, and it just got overwhelmed with people. And because it got so successful, they relocated it slightly. So it's no longer in the town, it's in a big ticketed area. So again, you have to purchase the ticket to attend. Previously, you could just, people would just be performing music somewhere and you could just sit in. So it was more informal. So that's changed it a lot. There's less of those formal interactions between people. It does have an impact in some ways on the economic benefits, because they'll often have food vans connected to where it's petitioned off now. They do try and establish, I guess, spaces where you feel more connected to people. So there might be, say, 3 large tents and you'd move between tents, and there might be a stage outside. So they try and break it up into smaller venues within the larger side. But yes, that's a really important thing. If that's what they're wanting, what happens when it gets so successful that it's actually, you're not able to have those connections. So they tend to relocate. With the technology, yes, I think we're still trying to figure that out. What might that look like? Perhaps virtual reality, those ideas that's being developed where perhaps you can feel the sensations of being in a space with those headsets and things like that. That might become a way of perhaps thinking about those more embodied representations. But I think that's still a little bit to come in the future. Virtual life, perhaps platforms might be a way of doing that. But again, it is a bit different, isn't it? Because it depends how the technology is able to represent reality to us. But some people are arguing, it's not long perhaps before that changes. And we see that even with medicine, where, people who are learning medicine to do surgery, they've actually set up virtual reality so they can feel what it's like to do that. So perhaps that's a way to go. It will be really interesting to follow and see, where that might lead. Have I covered all your questions?
Thank you very much. But the previous question, so what I'm curious about is if so that the small town or rural area, once they see that their festival is going very well at their beginning of their festival, do they really want to expand it, or they just like hold it at some level? Because
yeah, I see. Yeah. So that's where it gets complex, because there'll be different groups in that community. So, perhaps local government will be so excited about, we're getting lots of people in and really support it. But as I've seen in a number of the festivals in rural areas I've looked at, the locals don't want it, because it's too overwhelming for them. They can't go to the shop on Saturday because there's too many people around. So there's a lot of competing ideas in these places. So there's always that tension. So it's managing the expectations of what a festival can do, and if it gets too popular. So even the film festival that I talked about from Dungog, it got so popular that the residents who are out on the farms were really annoyed because they couldn't come in and do their weekly shopping because there was nowhere to park. They couldn't get into their normal shop. So there's always going to be that tension, I think, and it's managing that is really important. Does that help answer your question?
yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Next.
Professor, I have a question too. I just wondering the mega festivals such as the October Festival in Germany or the Tomato Festival in Spain, right? Yeah, I think the mega event has very positive effect to local, some such as the economy effect, something like the destination image. But in perspective of residents, that such mega festival makes some over tourism, something like there are many people at the same time in one city. So I think the residents, the mega festival has some kinds of negative effect in perspective of residents. So I think the festival organizers should consider the negative effects in that induce the over tourism. So I just wondered your opinion in this perspective. So what is the factor that festival organizers consider in these perspectives?
Yeah, that's a great question. My area is not necessarily mega events, but that does come into it. As we've already said, these small events can get really big. I think too, in Australia, particularly, which is where I know best, it depends who the organizer is. So we're in Brisbane, we're going to have, I think, the Olympic Games I think it's the Olympic Games in a few years. So that is a state and federal push to have that, because as you say, it brings in people, it brings in economy, it leads to all sorts of development in infrastructure, all sorts of things. So that's that particular organization who's pushing that. The residents might not necessarily want it, but will probably have to live with it because of that. And yes, it does bring in a lot of negative elements. Here in Newcastle, we have a fast car race, and it's the CBD is blocked off. And how people have addressed that is they rent out their house for the festival, and so they make money. Not just the location, but private people can make money. So if you're lucky enough to live in the area, you can do that. So that it's really interesting the way these impacts trickle through the community and the place and the government and the organisations. There are issues with mega events. So in Sydney, when we had the Olympics, they removed a lot of places that were social housing to make room for the Olympic Village. And some of the infrastructure they've put in hasn't been maintained very well. So that's an issue. And you hear about that around the world, when an Olympic Games comes in, the host community, the host nation doesn't want everyone to see the difficulties. They don't want to see homeless people. They don't want to see those sorts of issues. And so they moved on. So that's a serious issue for us to think about in terms of social justice. You're moving people just for this event, and do they benefit from it? So yes, I think there's a lot to think about in terms of mega events and their impacts. They can be very good. They can put places on the map. They can bring in infrastructure and boost economics, all those sorts of things. But what are the impacts for those people living there? It's a really important thing for us to consider. So thank you.
Okay. Who's next?
I have one more question. So
Sure.
Speaking about this overpopulated and over tourism, there is, as far as I know, the Europe, they actually put in limited tourists that they could come in to the festival. Do you thinking that this is really kind of like solve the problem that we're actually facing on?
It could be, and perhaps that's where technology could help. So you might not necessarily have to be in the place or be in the venue, but you could attend via technology. And I've the last couple of years here in Australia, a group in Melbourne set up a digital concert hall, and now it's Australia-wide. So you could actually pay for a ticket and feel like you're there at the concert, not quite the same. And now what they're doing is a hybrid version. So people could pay and watch online, or you could attend. Now that also might help people who perhaps have disabilities who can't access the spaces of these events. So that's important as well. So that is something perhaps that might be useful. And again, as virtual reality gets better, maybe, that might help that feeling of being present. I know with friends what we did, we're all in different places, and we'd purchase a ticket, go to a concert, and we'd catch up afterwards and have a chat about the concert and talk about what we saw. So there's ways to engage in those ideas of community. And, as you're suggesting, online might be a way to address things like over tourism, overcrowding, plus the environmental impact, to get to places, how much carbon are you emitting, all those sorts of things, but also perhaps for those who aren't able to purchase a ticket to be there in person, because they're often quite high, perhaps an online event might actually help with that as well. It could be a smaller price to pay to attend because it's online. But yeah, really interesting and exciting way to think about how we broaden and how we address these issues.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next.
Hi, I have one more question. So thank you for the lecture. So I understand that festivals could function as a way to revitalize a lot of local and regional areas. But in reality, I do feel like a lot of those smaller scale cities who may be trying to promote and facilitate festivals as a way to not only facilitate local community, but also sort of to promote the city itself, in fact, are struggling with a way to find the right content, for example. So what if the small city is they do have a lot of different producers, but their producers may not be famous enough for them to sort of symbolize, or they may not have the cultural contents, or their history may be a bit dull, because not every city can be special enough to be marketed to a certain extent. And so in that case, what would you recommend to such a city?
Okay, it's a good question. I guess, and it goes back to the two videos of the parades, doesn't it? Because even though they're saying they're rural and they're special and it's about their community, they're very similar. They're very, very similar. You know, there's these ideas about being in a rural place. You have a tractor, you have some animals, you have kids doing something, you have a marching band. So in some ways it's interesting because it's recognizable as a rural place, so people feel familiar. They think, oh yes, this is my place and we do this and I can see this elsewhere. But if we're thinking about investing in developing a town, I think that other strategies have to be thought about as well. So it's possibly not just a festival. The festival is sort of the representation, isn't it? It's the invitation, the promotion to people. Come here because you'll find this. Some of the festivals I showed was more about, okay, this is us and we're happy with us and this is what we want to do. But what you're suggesting is a festival is an invitation. How do I bring people in? And so the film festival, I think, was really interesting in that way because it was it very cleverly in that 2007 film says there's something different about this town, and it's linking it to these ideas about what a rural place is, and it draws on knowledge about what films are produced in Australia. So even that festival could be anywhere, but they very cleverly tapped into the local community, the Australian film, and what that place looks like. So I would suggest that a town needs to think about, okay, why do I want to bring more people in? And then what's the audience? What's the audience I want to bring in? So that was very specifically for people who were interested in Australian film. It had nothing to do with the town really, except they had that old film place. But they were very clever in tapping into that. So it's thinking, okay, what is particular about this place? What might bring people in? And it doesn't have to be so spectacularly different, because that festival still had the parade with the machinery and with the animals. But it's the way they framed it, the way they told the story about that place, I think was really, really special and grabbed people's attention. I hope that answers your question. I think it's working really carefully with the diverse members of the community as well. And what are they trying to achieve? What are they trying to do?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good. We have still, okay, go.
First of all, thank you for this really interesting conference. I learned a lot thanks to you. I have a question about the impact of COVID-19 on the festival structure. First of all, if they people will try to do like more small festival and or just bigger festival? And also another question, if the fact that people couldn't go to geographical space to go to festival, if they will tend to move more further than before, and if they will tend to participate in more festival now because they couldn't before.
Thank you. They're really important questions. With COVID here in Australia, we were not permitted to travel for quite some time. So that had a huge impact. So the online environment became important in just being able to do that. And the concert group I mentioned, you paid a minimal fee and most of that went to the artists. So that was helping the artists economically. But it's not till very recently that we've been allowed to even not wear masks outside the house. So I don't know what it's been like in South Korea, but that came from the federal government, so that and from the state government. So if we didn't do that, we were fined. So that closed down any event. It closed down sporting events, everything. It is changing. You can see people really wanting to. Well, there's two ways of thinking. Some people, it feels really, I don't know what it's like where you are, but it feels really odd now when people stand closer than 1.5 meters because you're used to that bubble around you. And so you're finding here in public spaces, people are more distanced from each other than previously, and that might change. And I think that has an impact on how we experience perhaps festivals and events as well, because we've had to stand that far away from people. So it'll be interesting to see if that changes. So there are people who are ill, immunocompromised, and they're going to remain isolated for quite some time. But you can see in certain groups of people, particularly younger people, I guess, they want to be with people, you know, they want to dance, they want to be able to touch people, they want to do those sorts of things. So I think, so we're heading into summer, and I think we'll see perhaps more festivals and people going. So I think we will see an increase, but who knows? we don't even have to isolate. It's just been decided last week, even if we get COVID now, we don't have to isolate if we don't want. So it's really rapidly changing, and it could change again. So it's hard to predict. It's hard to predict, but my feeling is that people want to be out with other people again. They want to be doing fun things again. So I think, yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens over the summer festival season. And some festivals have just gone broke. They just can't be held. So it's going to take a bit of time, I think, for particularly the arts community to build back. I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
We have still 2 minutes.
2 minutes.
I'm going to do one last question to who? Amat. Okay. She's from Burma, Myanmar.
Hello, Professor. I really appreciate for bringing the interesting lecture today. And my question is, as you mentioned in the Yakubu festivals, the purpose of the festivals was strong a world functioning local community, but also to welcome the new residents. But you can see like some places do not really welcome new residents for many reasons, especially after COVID-19. So my question is that, is there any changes of the local community perspective on the new residents after COVID-19 outbreak? If so, could you please explain and share your opinions?
Sure, I'll try. Again, because I've been in lockdown, I haven't been able to go to these places, so it's a bit hard to know. But a slightly different project I'm working on, which is around mine rehabilitation, so following on from closures of mining. We're seeing really interesting impacts on these communities. So this particular community, mining is fundamental to their economy, and we're seeing a shift to different sorts of economies. But underlying that, this community has always had negative perceptions of it. Initially, it was established for electricity. So it was seen as supporting Melbourne's electricity. And people it was post-World War II, so there were a lot of migrants who actually were paid to come here. The place was built for them, all their homes, their jobs. The idea was they had a job for life. So there was this real, a very strong community spirit. The mine was privatized, electricity company was privatized. And that happened in the late 70s, early 1980s. And that fundamentally changed the feel of the community. They felt that they were ignored, that they were seen as not worthy. What's happening is you're starting to get different communities move into that area. And so there are differing histories and different connections to the place. And so some people will see it as a very negative place and others will see it as a very positive place. They have been trying to have festivals. So I think the year before COVID happened, they had a festival in trying to enhance positive feelings for that connection. But I think we're a little bit behind because of COVID. So that sort of separated and isolated people again. So it'll be interesting to see perhaps what happens there. Also underline that, and again, I don't know the South Korean demographics, but here, particularly in regional areas, the assumption is if you're young, you'll go to the major city for study and work, and you may or may not go home. So for a lot of these places, the demography is really interesting. It's often the much older people and really young people and young families. And that group in the middle disappears. So there's really interesting societal structures that's underlying this as well. So there's so many different things going on, I think, that it's hard to predict, which makes it really interesting as well. And it depends who you speak to. So there's that sort of rural space, a shift from carbon economies. But that urban-rural interface is a really fascinating place. Again, it's shifting again because housing here is very, very expensive. And so people are unable to purchase their own home, even in those urban rural spaces. And interest rates for mortgages are really going to go up. So again, those economic factors are changing where people might live and how they might live. So I don't know how to answer because there's so much going on at the moment, but it's a really interesting question. So I hope I've addressed some of it, but I don't know what it's like in South Korea, but they're the sorts of factors that are at play here.
Okay, Professor Michelle Duffy. I'm very impressive about your lecturing style and your way of speaking and listening from students very clearly. And I think I should bring you again for discussing rather than the issue, but something language practice with you. Okay, you have very good English.
Thank you. Thank you. It's very kind.
Okay. Today we are very good. The lessons from Professor Michelle Duffy. We are about festival and then the way of festival and rural festival and the effect of festival. Anyway, the festival is one of the very important component of the tourism industry. Probably you may contact her if you want to collaborate with her, right?
Yeah, sure. That would be great. And thank you for your questions. They were really, really great, really thoughtful questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Even though we never met before, I just contact her. And anyway, just this is a word, contact.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. 2 hours lecture. I look forward to you and some conference face-to-face.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Very much.
Appreciate it.
Okay. 밥 먹으러 갑시다.